Hello, everyone, and welcome to our interview series. In this episode, I have the privilege of speaking to a distinguished professor from SOAS University of London, Professor Rebecca Ruth Gould. Her critical and creative work explores the poetics of politics and politics of poetry. Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation. I'm honored to be hosting you today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
In this exciting interview, I'm going to be asking Professor several questions. As the name suggests, we're going to be talking about poetry, specifically Persian poetry, which we'll be using as a lens. The first question will be, what can poetry, here we're interpreting through the lens of Persian poetry, can achieve that prose or philosophy cannot? Number two, why should the contemporary scholars research Persian poetic tradition? Why did the Persian or Iranian thinkers preferred poetry over prose to articulate their philosophical and mystical ideas? And number four, what aspects of Persian poetry resists being translated into English language? And how do the translators navigate these challenges while trying to preserve the poetic beauty and depth? These challenges are also real life for me. I've been struggling with these challenges because my area of research is primarily mystical, philosophical topics and themes within Persian poetry. So I'm very excited to hear Professor's answers. Professor, can you please give the viewers an overview of your research focus and your works?
My name obviously has been introduced. I'm at SOAS, and I have a project called Global Literary Theory that may be of relevance to listeners. It started in 2018 as a ERC, European Research Council project involving postdocs in Arabic and Persian, Turkish, and involving the translation of what I call, I think maybe a little bit controversially, literary theory. I mean, I'm talking about balagha, which is the rhetorical tradition of Arabic, Persian, Islamicate world. So text about it can also be translated as rhetoric. That's balagha is probably more accepted translation of the term, and more all-purpose is rhetoric. But I with this project, Global Literary Theory, we're looking at how this rhetorical tradition is, in a sense, a literary theory for the literatures of the Islamic world. And there are a lot of really complex texts that haven't been translated or understood fully. And my argument is that we have the major sort of poetic masterpieces of these traditions are often relatively well known in world literature, like the Ferdowsi or I don't know, Thousand and One Nights, Alf Layla wa Layla. But so there's a kind of canon in English of literature from the Islamic world, but there's no such thing as a canon of literary theory from the Islamic world. And so that's the kind of driving force behind the project, is to produce that and to offer that and to let readers know, regardless of their background, whether they're Persianist or don't know any language except for English or whatever, undergraduates, professors, whatever they are, or even non-academics, just this, that there is a philosophical foundation to many of the famous works, like the Masnavi, or that it's not, these aren't just texts that appeared out of the blue. They're texts that work within a philosophical tradition as well, and a philosophical tradition to do with the meaning of language, the purpose of language, the difference between poetry and prose, the politics of the poetry, its relationship to other kinds of representation. I mean, really the highest levels of philosophical thought. And I don't really think that there's so much material. I don't think that we got to the bottom of it all, but you can find out more about that project from our website. It's global lit, yeah, globallit.hcommons .org, I think, and or just obviously Google, or we also have a medium.com publication. So Medium is just a blogging platform, but we have quite quite been very active there after the formal project ended. So anyway, you can go and check that out. We have a lot of recent posts, and it's much broader at this point than just this topic I mentioned. We've broadened out to really look at literature comparatively. Yeah, and we're on social media. So anyway, that's the project, research project. But I could just show my books recently. This Persian prison poem came out in 2021 with Edinburgh, and it's in paperback, so it's affordable. As of I think a few months ago. Is that good? Yeah,
Amazing.
Persian prison poem. And there's actually a couple things, and then also I do a lot of translations. So this is a contemporary poet, Hassan Alizadeh, which I translated with Kivan Tahmasebian. It was shortlisted for the Sarah Maguire Prize and poetry translation. And then another translation we did, High Tide of the Eyes, is another contemporary poet, Bijan Elahi. And then just finally, this is a big anthology, our collection edited volume on translation and activism with a lot of Persian. We also translated some Persian Iranian authors there, like Farhadpour, Murad Farhadpour, contemporary philosopher. But it's focused on translation and activism all around the world. So those are some of my relevant publications. Yeah, and as I said, I'm job title I chose for myself was comparative poetics and global politics. So I also work a lot on politics, but in a very broad sense of just like the social implications of literary forms. And yeah, I mean that's obviously even more I could say, but those are my recent publications.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, as someone who is doing research in Persian poetry, my primary focus is Persian mystical philosophical poetry. And as an Iranian myself, I'm originally from Tabriz, although I study in Istanbul. These are all too exciting for me.
Oh, great.
Exciting.
Excellent. Many famous poets. You have the Makbar al-Shura, right? The big
Right.
statue.
Yes, the Maqbarat al-Shuara is this monument of Tabrizi poets represented by Shahryar Tabrizi, Muhammad Hussein Bahjat Tabrizi, known by his pen name Shahryar, who was a modern poet. Actually, I have been creating some episodes illustrating and examining Shahryar's mystical poetry, which is
Excellent.
much underexplored. Not explored, not just underexplored. Professor, you also have a YouTube channel. What is your aim there? What do you do on your YouTube channel? What is its name?
Well, thank you for asking. I mean, it's not something I don't spend much time with it. It's Poetry and Protest is the name. Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't prepared to talk about that, but I'm happy to. It's when I have time, basically, which is not so often. I share once in a while, not that often, but when I have time, books that I love, especially poetry translation. I have a few videos about that. I think I just started it because, well, first of all, I do a lot of interviews, a lot of lectures, and I just wanted to gather that in one place. And then sometimes also, people approach me with content that's very relevant to my work that I want to share that needs to be seen by the world. And so yeah, so I think it's just generally a kind of to have a kind of what can I say, to have an activist perspective on poetry, but also a scholarly one. I hope I bring some kind of in-depth knowledge of the topics that I post about that maybe not all on YouTube do, or not everywhere in the media. But yeah, I haven't been posting that regularly, so thank you for reminding me of that. I have to say, since the genocide in Gaza, I've sort of pivoted a little bit to using the platform in that way to promote awareness. But in general, yeah. So it's kind of at the intersections, and I think everything I do is at the intersections of poetry and protest or politics. I just think, I'm very invested in both worlds, and I think that sometimes they're separated. I mean, I'm very much like, I think of politics without a kind of awareness of poetry, which for me means like an awareness of history and an awareness of the ambiguity of every kind of perspective one takes is going to be very impoverished. And equally, I think people should be aware that poetry really does make a difference in the lives of people. It's not just an academic pursuit, and people have died for it. Not so much not so interestingly, not so much in contemporary, like in the cultures that I come from, not so much, but in the cultures that I study, quite a bit. So both the Soviet, I've also worked on Soviet literature a lot, where poets were killed like all the time, and it's true of Iranian history as well. So yeah. So anyway, so I think the channel is very broad. it's more of a maybe with a Middle Eastern kind of focus, but covering the thing news and books and stories relating to poetry and politics and protests.
With what happening in Gaza these days, I really appreciate your activism and your support of the Palestinians. Some academics stay quiet that, well, our area of focus is such and such. We do not work directly in topics related to Palestine, but that is not true. It doesn't matter what area we are in. Academics have this area of circle of influence, whatever area they are from, and they can influence people. They can change their ideas. The most documented genocide of history is taking place in front of our eyes, and many are silent. And you have a book, Erasing Palestine.
It was written actually before October 7, 2023. It was published in July of 2023, and then a few months after it was published, there was the attack of Hamas, and then obviously the beginning of the genocide from Israel. And I mean, I someone who I've always pursued. I mean, maybe I should start with how I have my PhD is in Persian, but the reason why I did develop some expertise as well in Palestine is because after I got my PhD, I accepted a fellowship, a postdoc fellowship at the Van Leer Institute, which is in Jerusalem. And I had some awareness of Palestinian issues and some hesitancy too, because it's an Israeli organization, but well known for its kind of attempts to create peace. But for me, really, it was a way of I ended up living in Bethlehem and then commuting into Jerusalem, and so really seeing firsthand the occupation, and it really opened my eyes. I was at a point where it wasn't my PhD was in Persian. I also work in the Caucasus, so I wasn't I wasn't like an expert by any means in Palestinian issues. But I wanted to, I wanted to know more. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. And I really, I think, fell in love with the culture of Palestine, with the depth of the history and the deep respect for poetry as well. But then also, I really I lived the occupation for about a year, and I came back, started a kind of career in the UK. And to my surprise, I learned that some people really had a problem with writing that was favorable towards Palestine, and I became involved in a sort of very controversial attempt, like this was 2017, to get me fired. That never happened, but it was it was very educational, because I'm not, as I say, I'm someone who I very much believes in the political value of literature, but I'm not like necessarily a very polemical person. And so I just didn't expect that my life would, that I'd find that. I'm not someone who stands up and, preaches to people, but someone really took offense that I wasn't praising Israel. And so anyway, that did happen. And anyway, so that kind of book is both, it's called Erasing Palestine, because I became aware of just how intense the investment is in the UK and also the US to kind of erase the possibility of talking about Palestine from our spaces, from our campuses, from our universities. And that's part of that I think correlates obviously to the erasure that's happening now in Gaza. And so, but I just want to say, yeah, because it was published a few months before October 7, as someone who has studied, had been studying and living, talking to people, to Palestinians living in Palestine, I obviously, expected the worst, and it's been even worse than I expected, though, to be quite honest. But I I'm now working about sort of the role of translation in this context, because that's something that, like, just like you said, I mean, I think all of our professional expertise, whatever it is, can contribute to raising awareness of what is happening in Gaza. And we all need to have a kind of reckoning with our traditions and with our governments and with ourselves, the fact that we're living through this, and people are being murdered just for trying to get food. That's not something that's supposed to happen, on our watch. So I am, I'd say, I don't feel that what I'm doing is in any way adequate, but I am responding in the sense that I've been involved in a translation collective of translating writing from Gaza. That's been published in quite a few mainstream venues like Al Jazeera, The Nation, New Lines, and I'm now actually just as of a couple of days ago, actually, I started a project called the Palestine Writers Workshop, which is specifically focused on poets, supporting poets in Gaza and who have been displaced to Egypt. And so, yes, so I mean, I feel like my literary, this isn't just a kind of, I mean, it is obviously part in response to genocide. At the same time, it, it's an extension of my interest in poetry. I'm not trying to like become a medical professional. I'm sticking with what I know and trying to kind of tease out the implications of what I've always cared about all my life, which is what language does, how language can raise awareness. And I think there's so much, and I think it is really necessary because I mean, particularly in English context, there's such a tendency to kind of reduce Palestinians and reduce the people of Gaza to just like victims or people without a culture.
Hamas.
Um, yeah. But it's so false, I mean, there's so much history and the writing is so of such high quality. And so I hope that's something I can bring to the struggle is just a kind of respect for language and literature as a way of raising awareness and challenging stereotypes as well.
I really appreciate this track of your research. Not just research, but I saw this person, like he was discouraging others, the academics, from getting into Palestinian discussions. And his line of reasoning was that, look, we should just be kind to people, we should be kind to animals, and do what is our duty, and pray for Palestinians. And I was just staring at him, asking with my look, what religion are you practicing? What religion are you following? And he
Right.
was a Muslim. And is that really like what you see from Islam when you read the Quran? Let us now turn to the first question. What can Persian poetry achieve, or if you prefer, what can poetry achieve that prose and philosophy cannot?
Great, sure. Well, I think poetry, if we look at it historically in terms of the emergence of language and of literature, I mean, I think it's clear that poetry is really comes before prose historically, right? It's the way in which people express themselves originally took what, even if like the meters were different or the whatever it was not exactly what we think of poetry today. It was in the form of poetry. It was not about documenting. It was not about communicating a message as much as expressing a kind of experience. And so I think that right there tells you, what there's something elemental about poetry that touches kind of the very most basic aspects of human identity. And so it's a kind of place where an idea has flesh, it becomes material. And yeah, and I think that's something that has been true across literary traditions, across histories. It's true in Persian as well. Epics like the Shahnameh, and the mystical poetry, Masnavi. I mean, they have been repositories of cultural memory and in ways that prose um hasn't. I mean, prose has depended more on written technologies, right? And those haven't always been available. Not people, even people who aren't necessarily literate, have still throughout history been poets and been moved by poetry. And so it has a kind of ability to touch people across class, um across so many different divides. Whereas historically prose has been something more of a kind of an activity for certain kinds of professionals like scribes and court historians. I think it's just, yeah, those are some of the reasons. I mean, I always go back to the etymology of shir, of poetry, and poet, shair, in both Arabic and Persian. It's related to the word for shu'ur in Arabic. It's kind of a certain kind of knowledge, right? That's very um, closely aligned with prophecy and with intuition. I mean, that's what that's I think even better word. But of course, intuition itself is a kind of, I mean, I don't mean it like in a sort of to be blasphemous or anything, but it has a kind of divinity to it. You know, if you when a person senses something in their gut, right? There's something about that that's very again, it takes us back to religion, to the foundations of our being, and that is the root for the word for poet and for poetry. And so I think that's not accidental, right? Whereas prose is something much that just comes much later in kind of human culture.
Let's now turn to question number two. I will be adjusting the numbers of questions based on how this conversation is going. So I'm going to be first going with question three, then circling back to question two. The third question asks, why did Persian or Iranian thinkers preferred poetry over prose when articulating specifically philosophical and mystical themes?
Well, I think it has to do with the history of literature and the role of literature in the Persian culture and Persian context. I've already discussed the kind of the central. I think there's a general centrality, especially in ancient cultures and ancient literatures, of which Persian is definitely one. A general centrality of poetry to other kinds of discourse, and there's a kind of a philosophical, justification of that as well. I mean, it's worth saying that I think this applies to Arabic as well. I mean, the Quran is not written in poetry. I know, but the language of it is. I mean, it's sajaa, right? Which is supposed to be. It's a discourse that is almost like, but it's poetic. You know, it's not technically poetry in terms of the theological distinctions that are made. It's distinguished from poetry, but it has the qualities of poetry in the sense that the language itself is kind of what matters. It's the way it's said, it's the way it's recited, it's the sounds. It's not just the meaning. It's not something that you can just kind of extract and then translate into other languages, as with the you see with the Christian tradition. I mean, until obviously things were different at the time when before in the Middle Ages, but in the early modern period, you had translated. Now, I mean, the Bible is obviously translated into like every single language on earth, and people don't. No one's trying to read the Latin or the Greek. It's a very, very rare thing, but because there's this idea of the separability, right, of the Christian message from the Christian scriptures. That's not true in Islam, and including in the Persian understanding, right? There's an inseparability. That the language in which the message, the revelation, is articulated is part of its meaning. So there's already this very high status given to like language. And I'm not saying that's the only reason, but I think that's part of the background of why this is a kind of prestige to sort of non-prose forms. I think poetry, from a kind of practical perspective, it condenses ideas, in a way that more prosaic discourses like don't. It can present things in a very succinct form. I mean, Rumi, I guess, is the master of that, right? Of having ideas that can be looked at from multiple perspectives and have multiple meanings, so they have a kind of philosophical depth. But it's just two lines, right? It's very short. Um, I guess those are some of the main, probably some of the main pools, the main reasons for the attraction. I think, once you have a kind of a tradition in place, like as with mystical poetry or Rumi, I think it's inevitable that that's going to be built on, right, by later generations. So yeah, those are some of the reasons, I think.
Yes, like you said, there are many reasons as to why some preferred poetry over prose. One of the reasons that has been really interesting to me is the multi-layer power of poetry that allowed especially mystic poets to articulate their ideas, their doctrines, with leaving some room against being, killed. Look what happened to Mansur Hallaj or many others. Poetry helps with this, like creating multi-layered meaning, like creating surface meaning, to get rid of the accusations and having like discussing what we really want to discuss in the depth of under that surface meaning. Another point that is really interesting is that when you're doing prose, you have to put everything in steps. You have to go through syllogisms, finish one story if you want to teach something through the story, and then move on to another story and teach that story in those steps. But in poetry, you don't have to do that. What is really striking to me, especially with Rumi, is that he's telling us a story, like especially in Masnavi, and all of a sudden, like there is this break. Another story comes in, like in one or two couplets. This is the fascinating part. He narrates a second story in one or two couplets within the main story, and sometimes completely irrelevant, or sometimes relevant, adding a different angle. And this power of poetry is fantastic. In a sense, it reminds me of the Quran's like verses. While you're reading the Quran, there are these apparently abrupt shifts in meanings, in topics, themes. We're reading a story and then we jump into another story from another historic period, apparently irrelevant to the previous one. And Rumi seems to be influenced by this.
Absolutely. I think there's something about just to follow up on that. I mean, the thing about prose is that there is a kind of logic it has to follow, like a linear logic, which obviously, I mean, any philosopher would defend that and say like that's the best way to do philosophy. But I think those of us who are interested in creative writing and in poetry will understand that that doesn't capture necessarily the workings of the mind in all of its dimensions. And so what you're talking about is there's a different kind of sequence, different relationship between cause and effect, also in poetry that I think opens many doors. Some would say, I think from the other side, I think there has been a tradition, even in Persian, right? Like Khasravi, who are very critical of that kind of preeminence of poetry. And they'll say that, oh, that's, bad for the Iranian mind. I don't agree with that, but it's an interesting thing to reflect on.
Yeah, and there is actually this expression in Farsi that sometimes when they want to say that something is not so important, they say it's sher, meaning that it's poetry, unfortunately. But it's not a prevalent thing. The general view towards poetry is very high. Like, this is not a common intellectual belief, but some thinkers look down at poetry, especially those who go after like positivist kind of philosophy, thinking that poetry is inferior to prose in the sense that people who want to write things in a lazy way, by lazy they mean not syllogism, go after philosophy, which is absolutely wrong.
So what I'd wonder there is that I wonder if that's a modern phenomena, if that's kind of the reflection of like an internalized Eurocentrism in a sense, right? Because I think poetry has not been the strongest. If you look at Europe, the strength of European tradition is more the philosophical, analytical side, not so much the poetry. And in a sense, maybe there's an internalization of they're comparing themselves, perhaps. I don't know, but I just doubt that, say, in the 12th century, when Persia was really at the height, of its Renaissance. I wonder if it had that kind of, if there were people who were skeptics. I don't know. I haven't come across that kind of doubt, of poetic discourse from that period.
Well, I would agree that it's more of a modern contemporary thing. Poetry was very respected in the 7th, 8th centuries. Hijri, even in Safavid period, 9th century, 10th, 11th, and sub-centuries after that, there is high respect. But it feels like the more we come to our contemporary time, the more there is tendency among academics to go after prose compared to poetry.
Mm-hmm. The more suspicion of poetry there is.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
But among many reasons, Eurocentrism has had its influence that when you want to say something, just put it in X plus Y, moreover, Z, therefore you get to such and such conclusion. If you don't do that, why are you wasting our time? Like, why are you talking about imagination? Why are you talking about symbolism? Just say something directly, as if that direct expression can capture everything. And one of the significant reasons for this is, I firmly believe the way some Orientalists have been researching and introducing poetry to the West. For example, especially when we come to the Safavid period, I don't know what is with some Orientalists about that period. Well, I already know, but they seemingly distort that historic period, especially its poetic significance, as if there was no significant poet. Like Edward Brown, for example, says, I was in shock. It shocked me to my core when I read this. He says, it's very strange that there is not one single notable poet in the Safavid era. And I was like, oh my God, are we talking about the same era? There is Sa'ib Tabrizi, with whom the Indian / Isfahani poetic style reached its apex. There is Faiz Kashani, with whom like mystical philosophical poetry literally soared. Faiz Kashani's Divan is 3 volumes, unbelievable poetry. And for me, it's like, how dare you illustrate someone or an entire period, 250 years poetry, 250 years, with such a biased, distorted intention and style. It's unbelievable. Like I have been taking on some of these Orientalists in my recent research.
For sure. It's prejudice, the British prejudice, I think.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, I think that you could also see that with the reception of Bidel from Afghanistan or Central Asian poet from the same period. It's a very elaborate style that I think is only now really being appreciated in English. It's always been dismissed historically as just like very ornate. But you know, I think if you enter into it, it's of such complexity and such deliberateness. So yeah, it's time for these poets, I suppose, to be rediscovered in English. Of course, they've always been known in Persian.
And especially those who do not speak Farsi and have to read from translations. Unfortunately, in their first glance, they're introduced into the Persian poetic tradition through such distorted and biased writings. There is a lot of exchange between Persian and Indian poetry, especially in Safavid era. And both influence each other. And that's really, really interesting. The two cultures come together, two different cultures, and they create something fascinating. But in Safavid era in Iran, despite what Edward Brown is trying to distort, there is like the whole poetic style, both like the content and the structure are changing. It's transforming in accordance with the changes in Iran, theological, philosophical, mystical, especially with the Shia school of thought becoming dominant. The whole style is changing. In the Safavid Iran, we don't see the Indian poetic style alone. It's transforming.
Right.
What literary theorists and scholars these days call Isfahani style of poetry. Indian style getting influenced and transformed by other styles as well. There is the style of Herat, there is Iraqi style, there's Khorasani style. So it's kind of a very complex period, and one needs to examine and research that period in the context of the changes that is happening, not reducing everything to a single lens that they would like to promote. Let's turn now to the next question. Why should contemporary scholars research Persian poetic tradition?
Well, I think it's often underestimated, I mean, especially by people who aren't experts, that just like the geographic scope of the Persian tradition. So, you know, people obviously associate it with Iran now, but if you really consider where that can take you, where the Persian tradition can take you in spatial terms, it's so vast and so fascinating. I mean, really from India, it was, I think, as I last time I checked, it was said that India has actually the most Persian manuscripts in the world, even more than Iran. So, you know, there's incredible flourishing of Persian poetry there. Central Asia, even Uzbekistan, places where Persian is not at all a native language. It was still the literary language, you know, like Latin was. in Western Europe. So I think for those people who are kind of adventurous in terms of their geography and like to learn about different cultures, like to travel to different places and compare different cultures, Persian it's really one of the most gives you the most scope for that kind of a vast geographic survey. Even the Balkans, I've seen traces of a lot of the Turkic poets, of course, Turkey as well. There's a lot to be done in terms of Turkish Persian literary connections. So I think that's one argument for kind of scholarship. It's not just about Iran. I mean, if you're interested in the pre-modern period in particular, there's no bounds really. It's so vast and so fast. And the Caucasus, of course, which is what I specialize in. I mean, it was the language of what's now Azerbaijan. So that's exciting, and it's exciting to think about how these manuscripts traveled from place to place. And it's exciting, I think, to think about a language like Persian, shaping a kind of cultural aesthetic among people who are just not very different from each other. I mean, from Turkish to from the to the Balkans to parts of Southeast Asia as well. Bengal, Persian was a very important language for all of these cultures, and I just find that very fascinating to kind of look at the dialectic, the relationship between the vernacular and the literary. And then of course, obviously, you could also apply those skills and that historical knowledge to studying the trajectory of Persian in modern and contemporary Iran. And I think a lot of the poets from the past are very much alive there as well. I mean, alive in the sense of relevant. And so yeah, those are some of the I think for anyone who like loves poetry and who feels that there are many traditions, that don't place such high value on poetry as Persian does. So that's another reason.
Professor, is there any particular topic, figure, or angle that you would suggest younger scholars to focus more on?
Gosh, I mean, just there's many. I think I would encourage people to maybe look beyond the canon, to look at some of the poets of lesser known places. I mean, like I was mentioning some of these places like Lahore, Delhi, Kashmir. These are all places that had a lot of Persian poetry that's not very well studied or very well understood because, right now in unfortunately, much of South Asia, um, there's not that much receptivity to the legacy of Islam and the legacy of Persian. So it hasn't been. I mean, so many of the manuscripts have been preserved, but the authors haven't really been made known in English or translated into English. So that's a whole world or universe of research. I think there's a lot of potential in terms of gender studies for Persian as well. We can get into this also in terms of when discussing like the challenges of translating Persian, but it's a language that doesn't have gender, and I think that's just very interesting from a kind of it's such a different tradition to the English one. And what so many different angles. I mean, I think there's a lot of maybe a lot of interesting research in terms of the kind of marginalized cultures within the world of Persian, like African perspectives, African Persians, Black writing in from southern Iran, what their cultural experience of Persian was like. But I think really that the kind of just there, I would advise any scholar to really move beyond nationalist paradigms. I mean, I think they can be very interesting to kind of, understand how Persian has been used, or rather Farsi has been used to kind of construct a national identity in Iran. But I think we should always, especially for people who have a kind of historical orientation, really remember that this is it's not about one country. It's a universe of experiences that I think you could, but just with Persian as your language, you could probably come to better know maybe 50 different, I mean that's obviously an arbitrary number, but I'm just approximating 50 different cultures that are non-Iranian, that use Persian as their language. So that's it. So be aware of that, and maybe consider studying Persian alongside a language that a vernacular, where Persian was the language of literature, and then you can compare it with the vernacular. For my part, I chose a rather difficult poet who, I would say he is well known within the Persian tradition, but is not well known in English, Haqqani Shirvani. And I chose him because of his prison poetry for my PhD dissertation and as well as the focus of my book. I'm like, I think in general, even outside of Persian, I'm someone who I was always interested in non-canonical writers. I guess what I would say is, yes, I think there's a good, that's a good thing to do. I would say also, let yourself talk to Iranians, talk to people, who have grown up with Persian and understand their perspectives. And I think they may lead you in ways that are not quite the same as what you would get like if you follow Edward Brown or something like that. I mean, it's I think you can learn a lot from that. And yes, I think there's no shame obviously in writing another dissertation on Hafez or Rumi, but it's exciting, to be one of the first people to study an author from 500 years ago. I think there's this kind of excitement in that, and there's so many opportunities for that in Persian. And I think I would recommend just spending time with the divans and reading yourself, drawing your own conclusions, but also traveling. As I said, I think going to the libraries, local libraries across, well, I mean, if Iran is obviously difficult for many people to travel in these days, but even in Tajikistan, places where Persian, is a language spoken or in the past was. I think if you speak to the kind of the archivists and the librarians and the kind of cultural workers, they can teach you a lot about what poets you might want to be looking more at. And of course, I think the Caucasus is obviously something. It's a place I know well. I think there's a lot of scope for studying more the Persian poets from the Caucasus. Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting point. I think I have a lot of different responses to that. So first of all, yes, in general, I agree. I think that my project, the Global Literary Theory Project, was precisely envisioned to give readers and scholars a kind of framework for appreciating the aesthetics of difficult poets, like poets who are very different, like say Faiz Kashani. So an alternative to kind of the Orientalist aesthetic, which is premised on a certain hierarchy coming from English and European canons, and is often just applied, uncritically to Persian and Arabic sources. I think that we have, as I that's exactly why I said at the beginning, like we have many of these poets, their names are known. There's articles on some of these poets, but just because there's been a translation of, say, I don't Faiz Kashani, I don't even know if he is translated, but just because there's a little bit available in English doesn't mean that readers have the full epistemological framework that they need to really understand a poet like that. And I think if they want that, they could look profitably, to the Balaka tradition to some extent. I mean, it's obviously different. Some poets, mystical poets, are perhaps doing their own in their own worlds, but I think ultimately there's a very rich framework of kind of appreciate. I mean, above all, really appreciating the aesthetic judgment. It's not the same. It's really important to say it's not the same in Persian. It's not the same in English. Even Arabic versus Persian are going to be different. And until the reader and the scholar has kind of internalized the aesthetics of the tradition that they're reading poetry in, they're not going to be a very good judge of it. So generally, yes, I think it takes a lot more than just reading the poetry. It's an epistemological shift that needs to take place, and I think that the one way of doing that is by engaging with the literary theories. The like you could call them. Someone else was calling this indigenous. I'm not sure if indigenous is the right, but the kind of the internal literary theories of these cultures. But then with that said, I mean, that is really difficult. As someone who's spent 5 years trying to translate this material, that's also not like, snap and a click. There's so many things that are just not translatable. And so I wouldn't want to, I don't want to make that look like it's just like an easy fix, because it's not. That's also a lifetime of study and effort. And so, I think it's completely correct. I mean, it does surprise me the kind of arrogance sometimes of Anglophone writers who are not, internal to a tradition. I guess I would say, I do think that, but, not all. The second thing I want to say is that not all Orientalism is the same. There are some good ones out there. Like, and even someone like Edward Brown, I mean, I think he was probably very blind when it came to Safavid poetry, but he was one of the first writers to really do justice to Tahirih, Qurat al-Ain, right? He wrote about her poetry, Babi poetry in general. I think, so they have the same biases that every human does. And I guess I think it's interesting too. I think I actually say I have a little bit more sympathy with like the really the old, I might say, Orientalists, like the ones from the 16th century, the 17th century, but there was actually less of a imperial relationship. They were just kind of like explorers. And yeah, so I think that stuff is worth looking at too, but obviously it's worth looking at as critically as anything else.
What aspects of Persian poetry resists being translated into English language? And how do the translators navigate these challenges while trying to preserve the poetic beauty and depth?
Yeah, thank you for that. So yes, it's as I think we've already made clear in our conversation. I mean, it's such a different the aesthetics of the Persian tradition are so different from contemporary English poetry. I mean, just to begin with, like what's considered beautiful. I think I often, one thing that I think has really helped a lot in my translation practice is when I started working. I did do some translation by myself, originally, of Hassan Dehlavi. That was my first actually published book translation, from Persian. I did that 2016, so now almost like a decade ago. But then I met an Iranian poet in Isfahan, named Keyvan Takhmasepian. This book, I'm just gonna, so you can see his name, Keyvan Takhmasepian. Wonderful poet, wonderful scholar, and someone I think who is very who puts aesthetics first. So he's not just a scholar who's like interested in accuracy, but really has an appreciation for the fact that who understands translation as an art. And if you understand it that way, then you have to really be aware that what you're producing, what you're translating, should be a poetry, but it also, it should be a poetry that is in close relationship with the original. And through our conversations, through our work together, um we really, it was astonishing how different, I would say, our aesthetics were. And the great thing was, like, we were able to talk about it. It wasn't necessarily, it didn't become an argument. It's just that um we read through, say, like William Carlos Williams, who's one of the famous modernist American poets. His poetry is all about concreteness, right? So there's a famous poem about the red wheelbarrow, and Keyvan talks about how he tried to teach his students that in Isfahan, University of Isfahan. He presented this poem by William Carlos Williams. It's something very simple, like, "In the rain is a red wheelbarrow." I mean, there's a few other words to it, but it's just like his students did not understand how that could possibly be poetry, because it's so concrete. There's no embellishment. There's no it's just like the most prosaic thing in the world. And I think that goes back to what we were saying, where, prose is really the kind of dominant literary discourse in English, and poetry is not. And so if poetry wants to become prestigious in English, it has to look like prose. It has to be very concrete. It has to avoid rhyme. It has to just have lots of images, not so much ideas. And that's the recipe for bad poetry in Persian. So, it couldn't be more different, really. It's like completely, yeah, it's fascinating how different they are. And I think you have to begin with that. Begin by recognizing just how completely, yeah, unlike they are. But then, once we accept that, once we accept the radical difference, there are these interesting moments of kind of convergence. So, like, we discovered, for example, together, that through our work on this Hassan Dehlavi, that's actually what we're working on now, a translation of his Masnavi. It's not very well known. It's called Ishknama. It's so Book of Love. And he's known as a ghazal poet. He was contemporary with Amir Khusro in India, in Delhi. But this particular Masnavi has not been well translated. And what's interesting, particularly about his ghazals, is that there are certain aspects, like there are certain moments where he has what he calls, what we would call, what in English is called enjambment, meaning that the sentence, or the semantic unit, spills over onto the other lines. And in a sense, that's something that, even though it's not developed in the Persian tradition, it's not theorized, it's not like a kind of something you would necessarily study in school. The fact that we can discover that in a 13th century Persian ghazal, and we could discover it as a literary technique, and then look at modernist poetry, and that is something that's valued. And so, there's certain kinds of convergences. I guess maybe the short version of how to deal with those differences is you got to accept failure, first of all. Just accept it. Just accept this kind of incommensurability. And then once you're ready for failure, then you can be surprised. Then you do have these moments of kind of little miracles that happen, and sometimes I think if you're, I mean, the kind of from a technique perspective, just being very attentive to like the strangeness, which I mean in a good sense, right? The oddness, how Persian seems odd from a English perspective, and letting that oddness kind of exist in its own way, in its own right. So not trying to domesticate it. That's a term from translation studies. Domesticate it. The idea being that a lot of translators try to like make it look English, and like one way. I mean, sometimes like imposing rhymes on it that aren't really there in the original. That's an example of domestication. So I think really respecting the strangeness of it. And that is kind of what poetry's for, right? You to shock the reader, to make them see something differently. I think yeah, so you kind of have to set the stage by just being very kind of precise and accurate, and but also being aware of how something is supposed to sound in English, using contractions and being creative. There's obviously a role for creativity in poetry, translation as well as writing. But then at the moment where we come across something that's like just very strange, very peculiar, just letting it speak for itself. I think if you can kind of prepare the ground. So that's my sort of memory of how the best translations happened. Another very difficult technical challenge is, I mentioned this earlier, that the often, especially love poetry, there's no he and there's no she. So that can be good or bad. I mean, it can open up all kinds of avenues for interpretation, ambiguities, which obviously is something that the Persian tradition relishes, but it can be confusing too. And also, I think it's an example of where it leaves open. A lot of Orientalists would like to kind of propose their authoritative version of, okay, this is either this is heterosexual love or this is homosexual love. I mean, they have their interpretations and they just impose that. Whereas I think it's better to let the text just speak, for itself. And so from a technical perspective, I mean, the way that we do that as translators, ideally, I think is to use a neutral pronoun, which isn't often done in English, but like, that's what it is in Persian. So yeah, so those are some of the challenges. I mean, there's so many, but yeah, those are some of the things that we think about.
The first paper I wrote was about Sheikh Mahmoud Shabestari's Gulshan Rose Garden Mystery. And that text is more meaning oriented than aesthetic oriented, although it has aesthetic aspects as well. So in my translations, I didn't run into much problem. But then I developed my research more focusing on Rumi, and I was going crazy. Like, what should I do? Like, should I go with the accuracy of meaning, or should I go with the aesthetics, with the rhyming? Like, should I do what Louise calls nativizing a foreign poem into English language? It was quite a struggle. So based on my the angle of my research, that is mystical philosophical aspects of Persian poetry, I'm more on the meaning accuracy camp, but I also respect the other side for those who are doing the research from literary angles. The meaning accuracy I have been adopting in my translations also continued into my papers about Feyz Kashani and my recent research about Shams Tabrizi, Saib Tabrizi, and Shahriyar. Take any ghazal from Feyz's divan, just erase the name that is Feyz, show it to someone who's familiar with Rumi's poetry. They wouldn't even distinguish whether it is Rumi or Feyz. It's unbelievably beautiful poetry. And when I'm translating his poems, and I'm still suffering because I have to sacrifice something. Either I have to sacrifice meaning, or I have to sacrifice the aesthetics, and he has both. So it's very difficult for me to sacrifice one side. And again, I go with meaning in translations of Feyz Kashani. Professor, do you have any suggestions, recommendations for translators?
Well, yes, be bold. I would say that for me, no, a lot of both of these two books that I'm actually, I think, well, two of the three So these two books, and then that I published from Persian, have had the Persian in the text. And so I think if the translator chooses that, sometimes you have to, depending on your publisher, like if you might have to fight a little bit. But if you're allowed to include the Persian, that should be liberating. I think then I feel like there is a license that the translator has to focus on the beauty of the text, because the Persian is there, for someone who wants to read it, it's right there. There's not so much, I would say there's not so much achieved by like just being literal just for the sake of being literal, because again, like it's anyone who reads Persian has the text. So that's one kind of workaround I suppose I would propose to people who are struggling with that. I think at the end of the day, I mean, I think obviously these are, as we've discussed, like these this poetic texts that you're talking about, they are at the same time philosophical texts, right? So they are all of these things, and I think to do justice to them, they should be studied as philosophical texts, and that means that again the meaning is going to be prioritized. But if we are of a literary inclination and we're choosing to study them as literary texts, then I think we do have to go with the poetry at the end of the day. I mean, so they're both like they don't have to. It's not an either or. I mean, it is either or in the moment. Like people have to make their choices one by one. But I think both of those approaches are needed. And I don't know. I tend to think that the literary tends to be more ignored. So I'll be the defender of that side. And as I said, I think in those cases, I think as long as I think there is a license for the translator has to produce poetry in English, I think that's kind of a mandate. But I mean, the caveat I would put in that is that it is better then to have the Persian alongside it, and to talk about your divergences. I think in a critical preface, to just be very clear about that. You could signal that to the reader. So I don't approve of like deceiving the reader and pretending like say Coleman Barks, like that's an example of a very popular Rumi translation that it's both I think it's a bit dishonest because it doesn't really, it's not honest about its divergences. Those are concealed, whereas I'm in favor of creative license, but I think transparency, and you can educate the reader to kind of see the choices that had to be made, and that could be an education in itself. And also no poem, I mean, no good poem is just going to be read once, right? So I think it makes sense to read it a couple times, to read a translation that takes a creative approach, and then to read a translation that takes a literal approach, and then to read the Persian, and then to go back and forth. And that's the thing about poetry, it's never just like a one time you take it or you leave it. It's you revisit it throughout your life. And so if that's your relationship to poetry, then I think you're going to want 20 different versions, and that have different strengths and weaknesses. So don't be afraid of multiplicity, I guess is the lesson.
I have been having recently an increasing interest in Shams Tabrizi and Shahriyar. So I will have two questions. They are personal, but it would also benefit others who are watching this video. Before, we knew Shams Tabrizi mostly through Rumi's poetry, but then Shams Tabrizi's maqalat came, that is his discourses, his own words, and it changes a lot of things, especially again with the Orientalists' depiction of Shams Tabrizi. There is this general trend that Shams Tabrizi was this illiterate person wearing robe, just loving things. It's not like that. Shams is a scholar. He himself says in the discourses that I was a jurist when I was young. Rumi's own son, Sultan Balad, says Shams Tabrizi had expertise in mathematics and in astronomy. That is unbelievable. This is Shams that we know only as this illiterate old man who came and just did something magical to Rumi. So my question, do you think if I go with this research, bringing into light different aspects of Shams Tabrizi and his thought, do you think it will be like the West will be receptive, or they are kind of fed up, saying, okay, we have heard enough from Rumi? And question number two relates to Shahriyar. Shahriyar is a contemporary 20th century Iranian poet who composes poetry in Farsi and Turkish, Iranian Azeri Turkish, not Turkish. So do you think someone who is contemporary and not so well known in the West will be received well if I direct my research towards his poetry, again his mystical poetry?
Mm-hmm. I think I could just quickly say yes to both. I mean, that yeah, I think there's a hunger for research that expands people's sort of somewhat narrow understanding of what the Persian canon is. And I think in both of those cases, these are relative. In the one case, you're talking about someone who is well known but not well understood, and I think that can definitely challenge a lot of stereotypes and prejudices. And yeah, I think people don't understand also the richness of the modern Persian poetic tradition and how that's the classical legacy lives on in also in more recent times. So yeah, I think I go for it. Yes, definitely, both of them.
Professor, thank you very much for this wonderful interview. It was very helpful for me, and I'm sure it will be also very helpful to the audience. It educated me a lot. It will do the same for the audience, I'm sure.
My pleasure. It was a great conversation. I learned a lot.
Now, anyone watching this video, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day or night, depending on where you're from and when you're watching this.
Thank you. Same to you.